This is the Memory Palace. I'm Nate DiMeo. The old woman kneeling at the altar in the flickering candlelight, lost in prayer, didn't hear the bear pad into the church of St. Thomas. And so her death, which came as the grizzly's teeth, sank into her throat, while horrible, was sudden and swift, and therefore relatively merciful as these things go. The young nanny, holding close her young charges in the back of the horse-drawn carriage, couldn't protect them from the lion when he pounced and took all 4 children away. The young women, seamstresses who had put down their needles and thimbles and scissors to stroll for a spell in the sun, did not expect to see a rhinoceros tear through the park, nor its horn tear through their friend Annie Thomas. The New Yorkers who woke up on a November Monday in 1874 to a headline in the Herald that screamed of a shocking Sabbath carnival of death were stunned to learn what had taken place in their city mere hours before, as they read about the rhino at the Central Park Zoo, and the zookeeper who poked at it with a stick through thin bars of its cage, taunting it for no good reason, just as the last visitors were filing out through the gates at the end of the day, until the rhino started ramming its body against the bending bars, until they broke, as did the bones of the zookeeper, as the beast barreled over him and rampaged on, smashing the cages of the other animals, until the panther and the lions and the tiger and bears too, grizzly and polar, and wolves, there were wolves, were all set to run loose and run amok. There were cackling hyenas and shrieking monkeys and apes swinging free, swinging for the trees beyond the wrought iron fence. The details were shocking. The old woman in the church, the nanny and the kids in the carriage, the screaming seamstresses, and poor Annie Thomas skewered. And then there was more. The startled picnickers who became a leopard's lunch. The young boys who were crushed by young elephants. The dozens of wounded flooding Bellevue Hospital, some barely clinging to life. They read about the bloody brawl between a tiger and a lion in the middle of 59th Street. They read about the wallaby and turkeys and pink-footed geese and giraffes and a tapir and a red-breasted merganset and a piebald grebe and a trumpeter swan and on, all killed when their predators finally got a crack at them. And they read the names of the 31 people killed, at least those who'd been identified by the time the Herald had gone to press. And they'd read about the heroes, the Swedish hunters who'd shot the lioness as she was Broadway bound, and the governor himself, a Civil War veteran, nearly 80 years old, but still a steady shot, who rushed to the scene with his rifle and brought down the Bengal tiger at the corner of Madison and 34th. And these New Yorkers who read about the horrors of the day before also read about the beasts still unaccounted for, anacondas and pumas, killers on the loose, and they panicked, some. Some stayed in, barred the doors. Some rushed to their children's schools to retrieve them. Some sprinted toward the docks, piled onto ferries toward the safety of Jersey and the boroughs. Others grabbed guns themselves and kept watch from their windows, took sniper positions on fire escapes and rooftops, or took to the streets toward the park to take care of the problem themselves. The editor of the New York Times took off to police headquarters on Mulberry Street to express his outrage that the biggest story in the history of the city was going down without someone telling the Times. But had any of the New Yorkers now cowering in their closets, now scouring Central Park, pistols drawn, now breathing sighs of relief, pulses finally slowing as they watched the skyline of Manhattan shrink in the distance from the back of the Staten Island ferry, had any of them run all the way to the end of the article in that morning's New York Herald, to the last paragraph, which begins, I will read it now. Of course, the entire story above is a pure fabrication. Not one word of it is true. Then they wouldn't have panicked. But they may still have been outraged, like the publisher of the Times, when he finally figured out it was all a hoax. Like the cops left to restore order in the city and restrain real people with real guns who'd gone out to look for fake rhinos. Like the mayor who didn't buy the Herald's defense that its editors wanted to dramatize the need for further safety measures at the underfunded zoo. But instead, wound up providing a lesson worth recalling now and again about the problems that arise when you let imaginary beasts loose in the world. Thank you. So I'm Nate DiMeo. If you've been listening for a long time, this is what I look like. I know my life has never been improved by knowing what the people on the radio look like, so thank you for that. I first learned that a very important lesson about life here at WBUR. I was realizing today that I have not been in this building for 22 years. I got my start here, I worked for On Point. Like in the startup team for On Point, but most importantly, I was living in Providence and was like playing in bands, and the band broke up, and I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And at one point, this sort of like art thing that I was doing down in Providence, we received a call from Here and Now, which at the time was like a regional news program, and they would, like a art thing in Providence was a thing that they might cover, and I ended up like, hey, can you do an interview of this thing? And I said, sure, I can do an interview of this thing. But while I have you on the phone, I kind of like to do what you do. And this guy named Mark Navin, who's still the senior producer there, he said, sure, come on up. And I was able to kind of like charm out my foot into the door. It is like, it's a remarkable thing for me to be back here. So thank you for being here. I was also remembering my very favorite WBUR story. So we were producing an hour of what would become On Point. It was at the time NPR's special coverage of the attacks of September 11th, and we were sitting there, and Tom Ashbrook was talking to Jack Beatty, the sort of sidekick and dean of letters from the Atlantic, and at one point Jack used the word ineluctable, and we all kind of looked around and were like, "What is that word?" And it was like, I think it might be intractable or. We weren't quite sure. So there was a dispute in the control room, and there was a big Webster's dictionary in the control room, which I don't know why it was there, but someone starts flipping through it, and they look up ineluctable, and they said, yes, in fact, it sort of isn't intractable. It means that an ineluctable thing is something. It's like a problem you can't avoid, that you have to deal with it before you do something else. And so then there was a sentence, and the sentence was something to the effect of the defense contractors. Pose a big problem, an ineluctable problem for anyone trying to cut down on arms sales or whatever. Quote, Jack Beatty, which was amazing. Think about that all the time. And is Jack the only person who uses that word? I don't know, but it's really lovely. So thank you guys for being here. I'm very excited to come back with a book, and I'm very excited to meet folks who have books afterwards. But I'm going to tell you guys some stories first, and here we go. The last time I was here, I did not need my $18 readers, but that's right, exactly. If the Memory Palace is nothing if not aware of time's passage, so here we go. Let's start before she was Mary. Born with the name Gladys Smith, to a mother who was a seamstress and a father who was a drunk, and left his wife and children to fend for themselves in Toronto at the turn of the last century. Gladys's mother took in boarders to pay the rent. It was either that or give up the kids. And one of those boarders, one of those strangers who came to live for a while in the house that Gladys used to live in with just her brother and sister and mom and dad, was the stage manager of a theater, and he thought Gladys was cute. Thought there was something in her eyes, something open and vulnerable and expressive and big enough to be seen from out there at the back of the room. And he gave her a part in a play and a salary. She was 7. And suddenly she could help her family. And if she could never put it back together again, could never bring her father back, then maybe she could get back to the days when their home was their own, when it was just them. And so she became an actor. The stage was no place for a kid, no place for a woman, people said back then, never mind a girl. But Gladys found herself on stage. She found a place away from the home where her father wasn't anymore. She found a place where she could become anyone, live out any life. And she found a way to keep her family afloat. And she found her new name, Mary Pickford. Picked out by a Broadway producer, she was an industry veteran at 12 and the breadwinner for her family. She took to that role, negotiating hard. She was the father in her family, she'd tell producers. And that's why she needed $10 a week when everyone else was getting $5. She didn't care that demanding things wasn't the kind of things that girls did. Didn't care that this wasn't what women did, because they did now. And if her responsibilities meant that she had to slum it in the movies when the Broadway season was over, then she would do that too. Mary became a star, which doesn't really begin to say it. We have plenty of stars. Kevin Hart is a star. Kevin James is a star. Kevin from The Office is a star in his way, but Mary Pickford was a new sort of human being, living an unprecedented life. Hers was the most known, the most familiar face on earth. She was a beloved stranger who felt like so much more. She was also the first person to really figure out how to be in the movies, that they could see you fine up there in the balcony, that you could act, you didn't always have to flail around. She fought to get paid, and she fought for final cut, for control over the roles she would play, over who would write those roles, over directors and costumes and all of it, until eventually she said, screw it, and she started making movies on her own. No studios, no gatekeepers, no dudes well-actuallying her decisions. This is Charlie Chaplin and Mary's future husband, Douglas Fairbanks, and the director, D.W. Griffith, who was a racist monster, but we'll skip over him for a moment, and we will look at Mary. After several years producing on her own, she decided to join forces and dream bigger. She and these men formed United Artists, a studio that was just that, a collective of independent artists making their own choices, raising their own money, cutting out the middleman. It was groundbreaking and badass and disturbingly socialist to some. They recruited other stars like Buster Keaton and Rudolph Valentino, and they made beautiful things. And always there was Mary, in 5 pictures a year. It used to be more back in the teens, back in her teens, but the movies were shorter and simpler and worse in a way. But in the 20s, in her late 20s and early 30s, she was doing 5 features, playing the poor girl, the rich girl, the poor little rich girl, and doing it all while doing it all. While she was playing those girls in her famous curls, she was upending ideas about women and work. She was producing and casting and balancing budgets and wrangling board members and writing checks and meeting engineers and audio technicians and figuring out how sound was going to work and how an industry would transition to the talkies. There's a thing we've all heard about hearing the movies for the first time, about how the advent of sound destroyed careers, of the debonair actor who was hiding a thick hick accent, or the smoldering screen siren with the secret voice of a police siren. The same way that video killed the radio star, like in this scene from Singing in the Rain.
Pierre, you shouldn't have come.
Pierre, you shouldn't have come.
Mary starred in her first talking picture in 1929. It was called The Coquette, and it's okay, it's fine. It won her the Oscar for Best Actress, and it was a huge hit. People flocked to it because after all of these years of watching Mary, of loving Mary, of projecting onto her, of thinking of her as the perfect daughter or sister or friend or lover, people were finally going to get to hear her talk.
I wish I'd never seen him.
No!
I hate him.
No!
I hate him. He killed the only thing in life I love.
It turns out they didn't like hearing her talk that much. And there was nothing wrong with her voice. She wasn't the sultry sex symbol who is secretly squeaky like in Singing in the Rain. She was just a woman with a real woman's voice, which was the problem. Because sound made her real. For almost 20 years, they'd watched her grow up without ever having to accept that she was growing up. While she was up there, flickering in the dark, living out these different lives, the audience was out here living their own, living through her and with her, their own Mary, as we do. The real Mary, the woman who was once the girl called Gladys, who had done things no woman had ever done, had ever thought to do, she quit acting at 36 years old. She made 250 silent films, she made 3 talkies, and she was done. At the Academy Awards in 1976, they gave Mary an honorary Oscar. She was frail, and she wasn't up for going to the ceremony. So they sent a camera crew to her house. It was called Pickfair, this huge estate in Beverly Hills, a mock Tudor mansion, swimming pool, tennis courts, 18 acres, 25 rooms, which she bought in 1919 after she'd married Douglas Fairbanks. And it was magic there for a while. The parties, the dinners with Chaplin and Amelia Earhart, kings and queens and Roosevelts, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Helen Keller, everyone. She lived there after she and Fairbanks divorced in the 1930s, after she sold her shares in the United Artists in the 1950s. She struggled with alcoholism. She got remarried. She became a recluse in that big old house. And when the camera crew came by with her Oscar in 1976, they filmed her on a plush couch by the window in a sunny sitting room. She has a green silk housecoat with a white fur collar and a pink turtleneck and pearls. Her curls are long gone. She has the same bob that she has had since the Coquette. She is 84 years old. She is an old woman. She's a real woman, and she is lovely. And it was the first time the world had seen her in decades, and they didn't like it much. They were disturbed, it seems, horrified if you read the tabloids, to see her old. Their Mary wasn't old. They didn't want to see her in 1976 like they didn't want to hear her back in 1929. But we are going to hear her now, getting that award in the home of her own. And you can picture whichever Mary you'd like.
Mary, I present this to you with great pride and with the love and admiration of the whole Academy.
That's wonderful. You made me very, very happy. And thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to have a book for a really long time. I will just tell you that straight up. And I would occasionally get these really nice emails from editors or agents or publishers or whatever, and they'd say, "Hey, let's take you out to lunch. You ever been in New York? Let's go out to lunch." Like I had 6 of these things. Every 18 months, someone would invite me to lunch, and we'd sit down and we'd go, "We love the podcast. We love that you have a platform." Then they'd say, "What book do you want to do?" And I'd say, "Well, the truth is I really love doing these little stories, and I think it'd be really cool to make, a collection of stories that work like this. And it would be like this kind of cabinet of wonders, and there'd be illustrations and all this stuff." And they'd say, "That sounds really cool, but that is not a book. That is not, there aren't books like that. What have you thought about writing your own Seabiscuit? What is there one of these stories that you could expand on?" And I would say no. I would say that some of it was practical. That the truth of the matter is the podcast was cooking along, and if I'm going to stop for 3 years and for history writer money, then it just didn't make any sense. But beyond that, it was no, I already did the research, and what came out was 7 minutes. It's just, this is what it is. This is what I do. And then they would pay the check, and that would be it. And so many years later, I finally found people that were willing to make the book that I wanted to make, which is very exciting to me. And I was having this meeting with the people there, the Zoom meeting, and I'm meeting all these people, and we're talking about this big, exciting first kind of warm-up kind of thing. And they're saying, we want to make sure this book sells to your fans. So then it's the conversation of how many new stories, how many old stories, what's it going to be? And one of the things that came up, they said it would be really nice if the people who've been listening for a long time, if you could kind of give them an inside, kind of take them under the hood or behind the curtain or whatever metaphor you want to use. And then they started to pitch me these ideas, and the ideas were uniformly terrible. At their very best, they sounded like DVD commentary, which is not a thing in books. It was sort of how about you tell the story and then you tell about where you found it. I'm I don't think I think that's the magic will disappear or whatever. And but eventually came up with this thing that turned out to be kind of fun, because as I was reading the book sort of over and over again for for editorial purposes and to figure out if this story really should be in there or the flow of the pieces or whatever. I had one thought, and that was the person who had written this book is really weird. that this is a strange thing that you've been doing for the past 15 years of your life, and that you do have a weird sense of time and memory, and there's probably something that would be worth exploring, whether it's a new reader or whether it's the longtime listener, that might explain like why you bother, why you care, because those things. And so in this book there is a section of memoir stories that is called Origin Stories, or 6 pieces drawn from the author's life as a younger person that in the aggregate could have served as an introduction of sorts to this book, but that would have been weird. And so here they are presented here on page 245 near the end. And they're they're like these stories from my life and kind of get at like why I do what I do. And so I haven't read any of those stories. I'm going to read you one now. And I will tell you that the reason why I'm going to do that is that 2 of my aunts are here. My mom had 3 sisters. And 2 of them are here tonight, and I believe that you too will enjoy these stories. But I do not deny that, like, when one has an opportunity to read stories about family to family, you take it. So, the thing that you need to know, like from the previous story, there's only a couple of little things you need to know, which is that in my 20s, my early 20s, I lived for several years in this house that they lived in as sisters, and that their father had lived in. And his, when his family moved from Italy, they moved into that house on Pierce Street in Providence. And so the first story is a little bit about me living there and particularly like falling in love with history, like by sifting through the objects in part and listening to the stories told at this table. But the thing that you do need to know is that also hinges upon a time in my family's life in which my grandfather and his brother Leo owned a nightclub in Providence, Rhode Island, where my grandfather was the MC. And he met my grandmother when she came down from Boston as a fill-in showgirl one night. And they fell in love, and she kissed him for the first time in like the glow of a Christmas tree. And, they were, together more or less ever since. So that's that story. And then this is the next story. And it is called The Beach. If you're counting at home, it is number 2 of the 6 stories that would have been weird. My mom and her sisters sold the family house in 2004. Their father had died several years before. He went quickly, fading suddenly at home and then spending a couple of days in the hospital, where he was peaceful and sweet, though sometimes he'd speak to my aunt, sotto voce, about the old-fashioned numbers racket he was convinced the nurses were running. Memories of the days of the Club Baghdad seeming to overlay the present in his dying brain. After his death, my grandmother moved into a whitewash shack not far from the beach in Narragansett, the only good investment her husband had ever made. His union pension went toward winterizing it. There was a bird sanctuary over the stone wall behind the narrow back lawn. She loved to watch the cardinals. She would entertain and go to the discount store and buy presents for babies, pretty jars for seashells, and knickknacks emblazoned with sunny aphorisms. By the door to the small deck where she'd drink her coffee in the ocean breeze, she put up a little sign that said, "If you are lucky enough to live by the beach, you are lucky enough." And most times you believe it, but it got lonely. She volunteered at a nursing home, playing cards with people in the memory ward who were just a little bit older than her, if that, which always seemed so brave to me. This wasn't too long before the end. She spent her last months rather contentedly in an assisted living facility in Providence. She liked people and seemed to enjoy the general bustle of cafeteria trips and nurse check-ins and visits from her daughters, who were now closer than they had been when she was down at the beach. The facility was just up the road from where the club used to be. Meanwhile, I had moved on from the house and went to Los Angeles to figure out if a long-distance relationship I was in was a real thing. She is now my wife. Soon came the moment when the Mancini sisters were putting the Pierce Street house up for sale, and I wondered if I should buy it. It was so important to me. It felt urgent, like not buying it was something I would regret, surely. But I didn't really have the money, and there was this thing with this girl, so I didn't. I do regret it. I don't regret it at all, and that is how life goes. On the last day I lived in the old house before my move west, I took a final dive into its darker corners. Once more up into the attic, a last venture down into the dungeon gray basement, which had terrified me as a kid, and from which I took the stairs 2 at a time as though I were outrunning a ghost, even in adulthood. I'd gone scavenging so many times in the previous few years that I wasn't expecting any treasures. By the dryer, there was a teetering tower of cardboard boxes that had repelled my previous approaches, sending me reeling, red-eyed with allergies. This time, I held my breath and jumped in. My great-uncle had lived in the apartment upstairs with my grandfather's sister. He had been a traveling salesman, and almost all the boxes turned out to be stuffed with brochures for a cosmetic line and with perfume samples that didn't smell like anything other than basement. The rest were filled primarily with yellow documents no one was ever going to need again. But I did find one folder of pictures, so I fled the basement one last time, excited to flip through them. I was mostly disappointed. I had seen almost all of them before, on the fireplace mantel of one aunt or another. Over the years, my mom and Linda and Jan and Ray had curated their own collections, accumulated on earlier expeditions to the old house. There is one picture, though, that they all have. I've never had to ask them why they all wanted a copy. Here are their parents, young and in what can only be love. His strong arms, her dancer's frame, my grandfather's smile. A look on my grandmother's face that had always seemed like certainty to me. I have assumed that it was taken on a day that my grandmother had told me about. One summer afternoon, they went to the beach. They took this photo, and on the way home, they squeezed into the back of their friend's car, where she sat in his lap in the back, sandy and sun-kissed, and she knew for sure that she loved him. If this photograph is in fact from that day, like what a thing that is. Taken at a time when cameras weren't ubiquitous, when their successful operation wasn't guaranteed, when each picture cost money that maybe you didn't have. How remarkable to have a document of this particular day, one that would be recalled and treasured out of thousands. The start of decades of love. Whatever that meant, however it changed over time, however compromised it may have been, however long-suffering or not, however simply true. What are the odds? Or maybe it wasn't quite like that. Maybe she remembered it this way because she had had this photograph. Maybe it represented some warm, half-recalled feeling from a time long ago, and the photograph crystallized it and turned it into a story. I never asked her about it. I don't think it matters. Growing up, that picture looked like love itself to me. In the folder from the box in the basement, I also found this. So this is an alternative version of the same scene. And it raised questions. Which photo was taken first? Was this new photo taken just before the one we all knew? Was the original photo, which is, again, looks like that, taken to correct something that the photographer, and I had never thought that there was a third person inherent in the scene. Was it something that he didn't like about this one? Like, looking at it, looking at the two of them as they sit side by side but not embracing, it's possible to read into it a coldness or a discomfort that the original photo doesn't really suggest. Which of these photographs is more representative of the state of their relationship in that moment in their lives? If this newly discovered picture was taken first, is it possible that my grandparents were cajoled or even coerced into the closeness that they seemed to exhibit in the original photo? Like, come on, Ray, throw your arm around her, you know? Had I always been seeing a joy that wasn't really there? Or perhaps they eased into the closeness that we see in the original photo, having needed the first take to warm up for each other. Does the long-beloved image on everyone's mantles project a happiness and a comfort with each other that they didn't yet feel during that day on the beach? Maybe the photographer, asking for a second pose after this one, coaxed something out of them perhaps they didn't even know was there. Maybe my grandparents were one of those couples that had been hooking up in what they thought was secret, but everyone was onto them. And maybe what the photographer said after this first take was something like, come on, you two, you're not fooling anyone. And so this smile, So this smile on my grandfather's face is one of relief. If this new photo was the first of two taken that day, one can interpret the space between them as positively charged. Two people whose mutual attraction is just about to draw them together forever. In that scenario, the original photo might hold even more power. Could it be that this photo isn't just a document of the cherished day that my grandmother would name decades later as the one when she realized she loved the man who would be her husband, but also might well document their very first public display of affection? I don't know. If this alternate take is the second one, maybe she pulled away. Maybe someone said something wrong or went too far. Or maybe just got cold in the beach and they'd been sitting for too long. I never imagined that day as cold. I like this new picture more. My grandparents is just two people figuring it out. It isn't the cover photo of some classic love story. It isn't love itself. But it may be life itself. One of those in-between moments that you don't remember later. The in-between feelings you can't quite put a name to. The space between the story of our lives and those lives as we live them. I love that space and the magic that seems to exist in the place between and beyond concrete facts and the well-worn language of familiar stories. I love the spark that is kindled there, to flare just long enough to help us remember that life, in the present as in the past, is more complicated and more interesting and more beautiful and more improbable and more alive than we'd realized the moment before. That notion animates every story I try to write. I want to conjure the magic that lies in the liminal space between the plot points in people's lives. I love these photographs. But there is one more picture from that day that I kind of love even more, and I would like to share it with you now. This is another photo from that roll of film, taken that same day on the beach. Maybe it is of the guy who took the photos of my grandparents. And what could be more real than having the one friend who pretends his lunch is his balls? I really find it incredibly moving. It's impossible to know for sure, but ornithologists tell us there were 5 billion passenger pigeons in North America at the beginning of the 1800s. That is 1 out of every 5 birds. And when they would fly south in the fall and north again in the spring, the birds would actually darken the sky. The flocks would stretch out a mile wide and 300 miles long. They would take hours, often all day, to fly overhead. You'd wake up in the morning to the sound of approaching birds, and while you ate breakfast and tended your fields all day, brought your livestock in at night or whatever, the flock would still be overhead when you went to bed. The sound must have been incredible. And the droppings, the shit from a couple million birds would rain down, defoliating whole swaths of forest and making fields fallow. When all those birds would sit down in the woods as a layover, it would take years for trees to recover. One nesting site occupied 850 square miles of Wisconsin. There was as many as 136 million birds there at a time. But all of this made them incredibly easy to hunt. It was said that if you shot a rifle into the air as they flew overhead, one shot could take down 30 birds. They were flying so close that they'd collide like some sort of horrible highway pileup, and they'd plummet. And as the American human population spread west, the forest started to disappear. And as industrialization and immigration swelled eastern cities, people needed meat. Industrial hunters stepped in. They lit fires in stands of trees to smoke the birds out and kill them. They would take a single pigeon and sew up its eyes for some reason, then they'd tie it to a stool so its panic flapping would cause curious flocks to land, and then be trapped and killed. Sometimes they would soak birdseed in alcohol to get them drunk so they'd be easier to kill. In Petoskey, Michigan in 1878, 50,000 birds were killed every day for 5 months. They were packed into boxcars and shipped off to Newark or Boston or Providence or Buffalo or Baltimore. That same year, a different Midwestern supplier shipped another 3 million passenger pigeons. And the birds started to disappear. The females only laid 1 egg, which is a terrible evolutionary strategy. By 1900, the flocks were gone. By 1909, the Ornithological Society was offering $1,500 to anyone who found a pigeon in the wild. The last known passenger pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoological Park in 1914. She was stuffed and mounted in the Birds of America exhibit at the Smithsonian. A few years back, she was put into storage. Thank you. One of the other fun things that I get to do here, so it's a little full circle moment, what with the family and the WBUR at all, is I also spent a bunch of time in China when we were working at Marketplace at the same time as Scott Tong from Here Now is going to come up and ask me some questions.
Well, so good to be with you, Nate. And I have a quick experience. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for representing how radio people look. So, no argument.
I was preparing them.
Yeah. Nate we worked together at Marketplace. We were in China together. Nate is the mensch he appears to be. And if I can, where are your aunts? Can I talk to them real quick?
There they are.
Okay. Nate may have told you this story. It's about 2005, and we're coming back from this reporting trip in China. And we're at the airport in Shanghai. And I have this violently sick episode as I'm boarding the plane back to LA, back to San Francisco. The details are bad. But we had to get off the plane. And Nate, I think you were dead. You had this awful cold. You were sick yourself.
I was ready to go home.
And I remember you saying that, and you were ready. But you couldn't go home for a day because Nate decided to stay with me for a day for the flight the next day.
You needed to get off the plane, and we also needed, we were not really supposed to be there, according to the Chinese government, doing the reporting we were doing. And so I needed to sneak you back through customs without any questions being asked about what was making you sick.
Yeah, I wasn't going to mention that part, but okay.
It's okay. It's not just only streaming, but it's fine.
Great relationship. We've had a great working relationship. And I remember even back then that you said, I love history. Mm-hmm. You know, I want to start a history show someday. And you've talked a lot about, you know, your own background. Just great to get the Nate DiMeo backstory, which I don't know. I know you live in LA now. But tell us a little bit about the kind of the process when you're drafting one of these magical stories. Do you revise 5 times the way a lot of people think about? You just have to write, walk away, revise, finally work up the gumption to show some people, and then come back. What's the process?
The process really begins with like it's not hard. Like people often ask me like, how do you find stories? And it's just not hard to find a potential story, right? It's like, I mean, you know, like we're kind of inundated with like facts and like historical information all the time. Like even if you're not looking for it, if you don't care about history, like in your, you know, on your feeds, your various social media feeds, like they'll just be like weird, like, hey, this one thing happened at one time. And so on the one hand, it's kind of easy to kind of like, you know, compile this list of potential things.
Do you have a notebook in your pocket all the time?
Like I use the notes on my phone.
It's on your phone.
And I'll just like write like, you know, there used to be lots of pigeons, now there aren't any. Like that'll be a thing. And then I will then move that to a file, and then I will, you know, when it's time for it to, you know, every couple of weeks, I'm like, what am I going to do next? What will often happen, and frankly, what will usually happen, is I will look at that same list, and it will be dozens of things long. And I will be like, how come literally there's no story I can possibly do? Like, why are these the stupidest ideas that anyone's ever had? And that is because I've learned that over time, like that the thing that like distinguishes, at least for me, like I'm not saying this is some like, you know, highfalutin thing, but like for a Memory Palace story, like the thing that makes a Memory Palace story, the thing that creates a story that is beyond like a factoid or beyond an anecdote is meaning. And what is most important in that is that it means something to me. And I've learned to trust that if it means something to me, then it's going to mean something to someone. It's not going to mean something to everyone. Yeah. But like over time, like someone might say that story that really spoke to me. And so it's then becomes a process of it's essentially of like waiting for meaning to match up with subject. And so, you know, there's a story in the book that is about Carla Wallenda. And Carla Wallenda was the last, you know, surviving child of the original Flying Wallendas. She spent her life, you know, bouncing on teetering poles very high up off the ground. And I noticed in the New York Times that she died at the age of 86 of natural causes. And I said, I wonder if that's a rare thing for a Wallenda. And then I look it up and I'm like, oh my God, like this woman is like so many relatives and friends, and her husband like died tragically, like on their backs looking up at the wire that didn't hold them. Like it's incredible, and it's incredibly sad. So there's something there. Yeah. But then when it starts to like really become a story is when I start to, on some level, see myself in Carla Wallenda. And like the things that start to appeal to me or start to connect with me is that there is something in her story about like, it's amazing to be a flying Wallenda. It's amazing to be an acrobat and to train and to like sew the sequins onto your dress and to get fit for your dress and to like work out and to practice and to make sure you're still in practice, even when you have to take the day job, like working as a waitress to like pay the bills. And then you're up on the wire for a minute and a half. And there is something that is appealing to me sort of like as a writer and as an artist, is like a person who comes up and talks on the stage that like, you practice, you rehearse, and like there's something about the life that gets lived between the poles of the story. Yep. And her story is spent on the wire, but think of all that other life, and think of all that in between time. And so when I find that, and when I know what the story is about, and when I know that there's some factoid that has been properly researched, so that I know that there's enough material there, then to a certain degree, like sometimes it's miserable, sometimes it takes forever. But it is like this active, almost straight through. There's either an ending line or there's a beginning line, and then I just start connecting them.
You start fitting them together.
And you just kind of, and the truth is, like almost every time that I'm actually reached the end, the story is done, and it's because I've like finagled all the way through.
Yeah, and you record it once, several times.
I record it once all the way through, doing pickups all along, and then. As a former one-time kind of perfectionist who was like afraid to like do the things that like he wanted to do, because like I love music so much, so like how could I possibly be bad at guitar? Like, and so therefore don't practice and get good at guitar or whatever. I learned that the thing that I needed to do was deadline journalism. That's the thing that cured me of that, and I loved it because like you'd be forced to put the thing out at the end of when the show goes on the air, and so I continued.
Well, when we worked at Marketplace, we had like 42 minutes.
It's exactly right.
On the air. Yeah,
and so I continued to put these like deadlines, but mostly it is just that like I'm just going to record the once, and unless I've made some terrible mistake, I'm just going to make it work.
Yeah, I want to pause and remind you what Stephen said earlier on is if you have questions for Nate, we want to hear them. And through the magic of technology, Stephen is going to take in your questions, and they'll appear on the screen. So you want to go to slido.com.
Slido, how do you spell
Slido? Slido.com. And enter podcast, and then we'll get to as many as we can. For now, can I ask Stephen? We've queued up a couple of your additional stories that I want to kind of ask you about a little bit, and one of them is one of your earliest stories that I was listening to this morning. It's called Itty Bitty Bombs.
Oh, okay.
It's like circa 2009 or something.
15 years.
Stephen, I can't see you, but can you cue that up as we're talking?
They had slaughtered as many as 200,000 civilians in the Chinese capital. Who knew how long it would be before the Japanese were bombing San Diego?
This is about World War II.
Salem, Oregon. The U.S. needed a weapon. It found a dentist. Or a dentist with a weapon found them. Anyway. On December 7th, 1941, that same day that will live in infamy day, Dr. Lytle Adams, a country dentist from Irwin, Pennsylvania, coming up on retirement age, was in New Mexico on vacation. At dusk, standing in a crowd of other tourists, he watched millions of bats pour out of the mouth of Carlsbad Cavern. It was incredible. On the drive back, he heard the news of Pearl Harbor. He was pissed. And he had an idea, one that could punish the Japanese and end the war that was sure to follow the attacks. He had learned at the caverns that bats could carry more than their weight. Females carried their young, often 2 and 3 at a time. What if they carried tiny bombs? What if you dropped millions of bats carrying millions of tiny bombs over a Japanese city? He called a friend who called a friend who somehow called Franklin Roosevelt, who loved the idea. The bats would be placed in containers, which would be placed inside larger containers. Each bat would be strapped with a time bomb. The containers would be dropped from a plane with parachutes and pop open in mid-descent. And the bats, 1,040,000 of them, would pour out. Some would burst into flames as they fell, falling onto wooden and paper structures below. The others would scatter, finding refuge in attics and eaves and under porches, the way the bats do.
Well, first of all, Nate, you have a thing for flying creatures.
I do. Yeah, I do have a thing for flying creatures.
Fill out the rest of the story. How does this one end?
Well, this one actually ends very quickly in that, this dentist has this idea, and he's going to tie these bombs up, tie these bats up with tiny incendiary devices and drop them out of planes over the cities of Japan, which are largely wooden and paper walls, and even in the 1940s. And and they were going to wreak havoc and set fires and terrify the Japanese, because who knows if there's you often don't know if there's a bat in your house, and they try it. Like, they build he's burning down like fake cities in the California desert or the Arizona desert, and it kind of is going to work, but then they shut down the program because they have a different bomb that can destroy Japanese cities. And so this is sort of like this is an early example, and you can tell because I have my higher register, and before age, it squashed that. But honestly, it's a little bit before I decided that, besides being like a ripping yarn, at some point I decided that wait a second, this should be a performance. That there was sort of like, why should I sort of like adhere to the kind of like tyranny of conversationality on public radio, which was all the rage?
Yeah.
And I was like, wait a second, I have like three tools. I have music, I have my voice, I have the cadence of my voice. There's like a fourth tool, and it is tone, and it is drama. And if I'm not being dramatic, then I'm like leaving one of those tools away. And so a story like this is, on the one hand, the goal is to make this sort of ripping yarn that has twists and turns and is as compact as it can be, but that also is like open to both the reality of a dentist, both like making you like taking that dentist seriously. What is that guy's life like? What is he thinking as he looks at the caverns? Trying to place you there through like the sort of use of like like the tools of like literature and poetry or whatever. But then also making sure that when it lands, that the truth of it lands. That the magic and madness and sorrow of it all lands.
Yeah, I mean, it just, for me, it so moves along. And when I read the intro to your book, there's one section where you write, "I feel people come to the Memory Palace to feel things rather than learn things." And that's how I experience it. It's a great experience. Quick question from the audience, Nate. Is there a story you've always wanted to tell that you haven't been able to figure out how to tell yet?
Sure. There's a lot of them. There's the whole section on that list. And
the hard to tell section?
The hard to tell. Like, there's a story that actually like is so essential to me and so essential to like kind of the understanding of how the Memory Palace works, but unfortunately, like I had this incomplete understanding. But it's basically about how Arnold Schoenberg, the guy who invented the 12-tone system that would allow classical composers to kind of get out of the rigid function of the eight piano keys and play the portamento notes between, in the same way that a violinist can slide in those discordant notes. There was something it was such a powerful metaphor for me. Like, as I was, like in my book, when I talk about, these two photographs of my grandparents and how I'm so intrigued by the space that exists between the poles of our lives, between the notes. Like, I'm sort of constantly trying to find ways to draw out that sound between those things and find a system that lets that sort of live. And there's a killer punchline, which is that Arnold Schoenberg does this thing that is so magical and wonderful, and he's trying to allow human beings to express something beyond the tools that they're given. And the little anecdote that I always love is that Arnold Schoenberg, who flees the Nazis and lives in Hollywood and is hanging out with all the exiles in Hollywood, he also lived next door to Shirley Temple. And he was driven crazy by the fact that people would take buses by and take pictures of Shirley Temple's house. And he had invented the 12-tone system, and no one was taking pictures of his house. And I've never quite cracked it.
Another question from one of you here. Nate, you talk about having a strange relationship to the past. How old were you when you learned this about yourself?
Well, I was really fascinated with the past as a young kid. Some of it was that the stories that my aunts and their parents, and then my dad and his brothers, would tell about the old neighborhood and stuff. I was just really clued in. They were all good storytellers, and there was something. But what was so interesting to me about that was that I was really fascinated with the way that a story well told creates like someone else is having a memory. Someone's telling you a story about them, but their memory kind of transfers over to you, and you have this own little movie in your head. And and those memories, to a certain degree, are as solid. My memories, imagining my grandmother riding in that car, are as visual and as visceral as some memories that I have myself. And when it's kind of clued into the notion that the past is only an imaginary space. It happened. We can dig up the bones. We can read the documents, but the only way that it can live on is through our imaginations. That was sort of like a thrilling realization, and part of the project of the Memory Palace was always trying to find, turning to literature, which also has that ability to create those magical spaces that you can, be in your bed, and you can also be in Middle Earth or in space, or in the Cotswolds, with Mr. Darcy or whatever. That's as close as we get to transport and magic, and that's a conjuring act. And I always wanted to, since I've found this medium, it has always been kind of focused on finding ways to conjure those spaces.
Yeah. You have mentioned another question in other interviews, Nate, that the meaning you look for is often either epiphany or trauma. Epiphany or trauma. How do you choose one or the other?
Well, I don't choose, but I have there's a story in the book that's. It is called a thing that my mom saw on TV once. And it's this conversation that I have about this thing that my mom saw on TV once. And it's this little morning show segment that she watched. And she told me this thing that she saw, and hit me like a ton of bricks. And I think a lot about how often, we all think about trauma, and we understand how trauma lives in the body, and it's the ways these memories can kind of live and continue to harm you and create these other spaces that are not imaginary, even though they are. They create these visible somatic responses. But I've also sort of come to realize and think a lot about that that epiphany is the inverse of trauma. That it is these things that when you really get something, and when you're sort of drawn into kind of presence and consciousness, and really get something, or really see someone, or really understand that they are, their own person, really understand that they have, this conversation you're having is a gift or whatever. When you reach that state, it also sort of that joy and connection, can sort of imprint in the same way. Mm-hmm. And and so when it all comes down to it, I'm not sure, whether I'm, choosing between two different doors or two different paths in any given story or something like that. But I've also noticed, as I read these stories that I've been writing for the course of these past 16 years, and be God, this guy just says the same thing over and over again, that there are only several things that I'm genuinely interested in. That is one of them.
Can I? And I know, Nate, in a few minutes you're going to come back up and tell a couple more stories, and I'm looking forward to those. But take it as something that you clearly think about, present in your stories, and you write in the book, is the notion is, how is history going to think about us now? And you write in your intro, our present moment is itself historical. Yeah. So I've been thinking about that all day, and I had about 6 minutes to pull out my inner Nate DiMeo. Can I start a little story?
Please. Of
somebody writing about us?
Sure. Let's do it.
And you've been my editor, so whatever you want to do.
I forgot about that. That's true.
Okay.
All right.
This is first draft. His first name was Nate. He mined the big and the small lessons of history from the industrial and the technology ages in North America. He chronicled the dreamers, the flyers, the victims. He spoke by voice to a loyal following of listeners who tuned into his recordings through something called Wi-Fi and a low-tech 21st century delivery device called a podcast. He observed life through his own time, the 2010s, the 2020s, when Americans obsessed with a man who swung a stick named Soto, and a woman with bangs named Taylor, and a pill to lose dramatic amounts of weight, whatever. The listeners were literate urban Americans, curious, who tended to work in offices. they jogged, they lived in cities, they had pricey educations, and they worked in jobs referred to at the time as the service economy. But what they missed was a germ that would change everything, growing in a remote part of Africa that no one paid attention to, except for this second-rate research scientist named Maria. That's all I have.
Sure.
Okay.
No, you're on to something.
How do you think about the Nate DiMeo in his century talking about us?
I mean, the truth of the matter is like why I do this in like a very real, ridiculous way is I like to look back to the past, and it's not because like I'm not 100% sure that we need to remember anything at all. Like you can get through most days without knowing who Dwight David Eisenhower was, you know?
Yeah.
But that said, I find it useful, not just because there are heroes to find and there are lessons to learn, because there are, but mostly I find it useful to like remember like a couple of important things. One, we are all going to die, and that like let's make the most of it as we can, and that is like the most basic of ideas, but it's hard to hold. And I find that holding it and remembering it makes me, a better, parent and spouse and nephew. And I also, find that like the other thing about it is that like our lives are themselves historical. That in remembering that, like that this is the time that we have, and this is what the materials that we have to work with. This is the technologies that we use. I find it snaps me into presence, and like it snaps me into presence in the present, and I find it useful because I feel like it makes me a better citizen. Yeah. Like it makes me like by remembering just how quickly so many like change can take place, and how much work it sometimes takes, and how miasmic and polyvariant and that like it is not that Hegel wasn't entirely right, but at the same time it is the conflict that pushes history forward, but it's coming from all directions, in that the past, like the present, feels like everything all the time all at once. And in the same way that literally you can go right now and there will be 17 different conversations happening about, I don't know, whether Derek White should get more minutes for the Celtics, and no one will come to the proper decision. Like that's exactly the way the past was happening. The past was just like the present, and I have always found that useful to remember.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to step off in a second.
Sure.
Nate and everyone, enjoy these next few moments together, as Nate described so well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott. All right, I got a couple more stories, and then we'll be on our way, and I'll go sign books. I was doing this the other night in Richmond, Virginia, and I started the story, and then I realized that I was missing a page. So you will forgive me if I take a second to count the pages. I did have the foresight tonight to write the numbers on the pages, but then I was just sitting there going like, did I look when I wrote those? Let me make sure they're in order. Yep, that's right. That's right. That's right. And that's right. The dream came to her in the water. She was 6, she always said. In the Pacific, at the foot of the cliffs, rippled sandstone, orange in the late summer light, at Point Loma, at the mouth of San Diego Bay, her parents watching, smiling on the blanket and the beach, or splashing nearby in the surf, beaming at their girl. How she took to the water. A mermaid, a harbor seal. They didn't have much, her parents. Her dad was a cop. Her mom kept the house. They didn't have much, but they had the sea. Right down the block, down the worn path lined with wildflowers and sea beans that snaked down the hill from the lighthouse. And that was enough. It was everything to Florence, who spent her childhood in the water at the edge of America, swimming the channel where conquistadors sailed 400 years before, where the Pacific Fleet would pass through on its way to Wake Island and Midway and Guadalcanal some 20 years later. Florence Chadwick learned to swim, to read the currents and the rhythm of the waves, to keep her hips up, to reach out as far as she could, and to breathe. Right arm, breathe, left arm, right arm, breathe, left arm, and on and on and onward. She was 10 when she first swam all the way across the mouth of the bay. And the dream that had come to her in the water, the dream she'd had now for more than half her life, must have started to feel possible. She would swim the English Channel one day. Two years earlier, an American, Gertrude Ederle, just 19 years old herself, had done it, had become the first woman and just the sixth person to swim from England to France, or vice versa. It had seemed an impossible feat, until this band of ocean, this unbreachable barrier that had once kept barbarians and Napoleon and the Spanish Armada at bay, was pierced. First by a British sailor in 1875, and then in 1926 by a young New Yorker, faster than any of the 5 men before her by nearly 2 full hours. There's an item in the local paper of Clovis, California, a cow town in the Central Valley, about 6 hours and a world away from San Diego, summer of '31. There is a photo of Florence in a black bathing suit and 2 white stars on one of the shoulder straps. She's got a bobbed, hydrodynamic hairdo. An awkward, adolescent, purse-lipped smile sits a little over-wide on her face. She hugs her knees to her chest. The caption says, Olympic prospect. She is 12 years old. She had already won prestigious races in the open ocean against adults, against men, and was training in the pool for the 1932 Summer Games to take place just up the coast road in LA. But she didn't make the team. That next year, or the Berlin Olympics in '36. Because she wasn't that good in the pool. I mean, she was better than most. She is better than me, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say better than you, no offense, but Florence got used to the view from the lower podiums and barely missing the cut and being runner-up. Because what she was good at, what she was great at, wasn't in the Olympics. The skills that she had developed, the expertise earned over countless days spent in the ocean, the lessons learned about tides and currents and technique and pace and repeatable movements and sharks and jellyfish and skincare. They came to know her the way she came to know her own body, know her breath and her balance, the way she built that body to do things that other people's couldn't do, adapted it to move through a moving world, to rise and fall as it rose and fell around her, to withstand its cold, to push fearlessly through its darkness, to go for hours and hours and hours onward and onward and onward. Those skills didn't translate to the 50-meter backstroke. There is a race every year back home in San Diego, 2.5 miles in rough water across the bay, a sprint for her basically. But there was no Olympic medal for her kind of swimming and no way to make money doing it. But she loved it, and she still dreamt of the channel. She went to college at San Diego State, took office jobs, and would take to the ocean every chance she got. She got married twice, once before the war, once during the war, and got divorced twice. She said learning to be a good wife would take time she didn't have, would require passion she couldn't muster, not for marriage anyway. Instead, her passion brought her to Saudi Arabia, where she took a job at the American Oil Company. And every morning and every night and every chance she got when she wasn't working an adding machine in the secretarial pool, she was in the Persian Gulf, training for the channel. Right arm, breathe, left arm, right arm, breathe, left arm, day after day, onward and onward and onward for 2 years straight. And in 1950, a British paper put up prize money for anyone who could swim the 21 miles from the continent to the British Isles. No one had done it in 16 years, but they wouldn't let her enter the contest. She wasn't famous enough. She wasn't an Olympian, she was a secretary. So at 31 years old, she took the money she'd made at the Arabian American Oil Company, and she funded her own assault on the channel, hiring boats, paying for hotels, bringing her father, the California cop, to France, so he could ride in a fishing boat beside her through the churning channel and shout encouragement, as he had done from the beach at Point Loma, when she had first learned to swim away from him. And on August 8th, 1950, at 2:30 in the morning, she stepped along the rocks at the edge of the land. She slipped into the cold waves and went to work, hips up, reaching out as far as she could, rising and falling with the world around her, fearless in the dark, in foreign waters that spoke that same old language of currents and tides. Right arm, breathe, left arm, right arm, breathe, left arm. Her father calling out, beaming, feeding her sugar cubes. Right arm, breathe, left arm, right arm, breathe, left arm, onward and onward and onward.
When Miss Florence Chadwick, a 31-year-old typist from California, completed her channel swim, she set up a new women's record of 13 hours, 23 minutes. Watched by spectators on the cliffs between Dover and Deal, she finished in great style after a very fine effort indeed. A real triumph, for it was her first attempt.
She became world famous. There were parades and newsreels and interviews and autographs and endorsements.
I drink chocolate-flavored Ovaltine. Remember, I said Ovaltine.
And this was all just reward, commensurate with this spectacular achievement. She had swum the English Channel, a feat that had held particular power in a particularly powerful culture for as long as anyone could remember. An extraordinary physical feat that for a time was the very definition of a physical feat. And after she did it, after she stepped onto the sand at the foot of the cliffs of Dover and smiled for the cameras, ecstatic and all teeth this time, she got into a boat and went back to France. It was a quicker trip. But for that, like an hour and a half, I think. On late afternoon in midsummer, her body sore but light, warmer now in the sun, her swim cap off, her hair blowing, her dad there, friends, strangers, and fans and cameras waiting on the opposite shore to wish her well, to celebrate her achievement, and to shine for a bit in her glow. There she is on a boat in the breeze, having done at 31 what she had set out to do at 6. And I'm tempted to leave her there, and leave you there with her on that boat in that moment, because who wouldn't want to stay there in a moment like that? But she is 31. She will die at 77 in 1995 of leukemia in San Diego, and it will be too young. But there's so much life to live between this moment on the boat and the end. And though there will be no moment like this one, when the world first learns her name, when the dreams she's fulfilled is so pure and precise and easily understood and explained, there will be other moments and other dreams. There has to be, with that much more life left to live. Florence Chadwick spent hers in the open water. She went on to swim the English Channel 4 more times, each to diminishing fanfare, because come on. During one of those, she became the first woman to swim it in both directions. She became the first woman to swim the Straits of Gibraltar, the Bosporus, the Dardanelles, the 23-mile channel between the California mainland and Catalina Island. She did that 3 times. She went around the world going anywhere that there was a community with a channel that needed crossing. Some gap that had defined distance and possibility for generations there that needed redefining. Sometimes she'd fail. She didn't make it across Lake Ontario. She tried 3 times to cross the North Channel from Ireland to Scotland, 18 frigid miles, and never made it. She taught swimming. She spent summers at one of those fancy resorts in the Catskills coaching kids in the pool, but probably longing for the sea. She was a stockbroker. She moved home to take care of her mom. In 1974, she rowed in the boat like her dad did, alongside a student from San Diego State who tried to swim the channel but didn't make it. And I could leave you there, in her 50s, her record-breaking days behind her, beaming at a student, hitching her hopes to another woman in the water. But let's leave you in the water. On any one of those countless days, on any one of those races or crossings, or just some evening after work. Florence Chadwick in the ocean, hips up, reaching out as far as she can. Right arm, breathe, left arm. Right arm, breathe, left arm. And on and on, and onward and onward, and onward and onward, and onward and onward, and onward and onward, and onward and onward and onward. Thank you. I'm going to tell one real quick story. So, I was telling Scott that, at some point I realized it was that this should be a performance. And there was one specific story that I did. And the story has become, when I think about it, and when I was putting this book together, I realized how sort of pivotal this story was. Because on the one hand, it's weird, and I've decided that I kind of like the weird ones the most. And it just kind of opened up possibilities. There's something about wait, if I can do an episode about this, then I can do episodes about a whole lot of things. And I also, I said the last line of the story incredibly dramatically, and it was an accident. And I was like, God, I sound ridiculous. And then I was like, or do I? And then I've kind of been leaning in ever since. So thank you all for being here. Podcasting is a lonely profession, and it is incredibly nice to be in the room with you people. And I'll also be in that room signing books. And the other thing, too, is I do not take for granted the fact that you guys are here at all. Never mind that many of you are buying a book. I don't know that I would be here. There are so many things that I love, and I don't drive across town to go see. And so I really appreciate it. It matters tremendously. Thank you. The story is called These Words Forever. Guglielmo Marconi is the father of radio. He didn't really invent it. He got much more credit than he deserves, but whatever. Guglielmo Marconi was the father of radio. He was a hero on the scale that the nation of Italy hadn't seen since the Renaissance. I have a postcard that I found in my grandfather's attic after he died. It has a picture of Marconi on the front and a message in Italian on the back encouraging immigrants like my grandfather's family to express their pride in their countrymen by investing in the Marconi Company. He was celebrated all over the world. He dined with presidents and kings and captains of industry, beautiful women. He shared a Nobel Prize. He got just about every honor the Italian government had to give. Benito Mussolini was the best man at his second wedding, which I'm sure felt like a good idea at the time. But we are told when he was in his 60s, somewhere around the time of his 4th or 5th heart attack, the inventor began to think about mortality. Or rather, he began to think about immortality. Marconi became convinced that sound never dies, that sound waves once emitted from a radio, from the vibrating strings of a Stradivarius, from whispering lovers, or a baby discovering how to make a ba or ga sound for the very first time, lived on forever, flowing permanently but growing weaker and weaker with each moment. He just hadn't managed yet to build a radio powerful enough to tune in the signal. And this wasn't entirely foolish. One of the things that had made Marconi famous was the sinking of the Titanic. 705 people were rescued from the icy water after radio men on nearby ships heard its wireless distress signal. Newspapers around the world credited Marconi as those passengers' savior. One of those radio men, working the night shift on a Russian steamer, heard a signal through his headphones more than an hour and a half after it was sent. This was a physical anomaly, just atmospheric conditions or whatnot. But here was Marconi near the end of his life, growing weaker and weaker with each heart attack, dreaming of a device that would let him hear those lost sounds, that would let him tap into these eternal frequencies. He would tell people that if he got it right, he would be able to hear Jesus of Nazareth giving the Sermon on the Mount. He would be able to hear everything that had ever been said. At the end of his life, he could sit in the piazza in Rome and hear everything that was ever said to him or about him. He could relive every toast and testimonial. We all could. Hear everything. Hear Marco Polo talk to Genghis Khan. Hear Shakespeare give an actor a line reading. Hear my grandmother introduce herself to my grandfather at a nightclub in Rhode Island. Hear someone tell you they love you the first time they told you they loved you. Hear everything forever. Thank you, guys.